The wind was a blade against the mountainside, sharp enough to peel bark from the ancient pines and scour the granite faces of the peaks until they wept dust. It carried the scent of snow, a clean, sterile cold that promised to bleach the world of all life and color. Jedediah felt the cold in his bones, a familiar ache that had settled there decades ago and never truly left, but he moved through the white-dusted forest with the heavy, unhurried gait of a creature born to it. His hair and beard were a wild, dark mane threaded with grey, catching snowflakes that melted against the warmth of his skin. He was a colossal man, built of the same stone and timber as his surroundings, his shoulders a bulwark against the storm as he checked the line of his snares. Most were empty, the forest hunkered down and waiting for the worst of the blizzard to pass. It was on his way back to the distant, lonely plume of smoke that marked his cabin that he saw it, a patch of grey against the snow that was not rock or shadow. He stopped, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his eyes narrowing. It was small, huddled at the base of a fir tree whose lower branches offered the barest illusion of shelter. He moved closer, his snowshoes making soft, crunching sounds that were swallowed by the wind's howl. It was a person. A woman. She was curled into a tight ball, her face tucked into her knees, her body wrapped in a thin, grey silk dress that was utterly alien to this brutal landscape. It was a cheongsam, worn and frayed at the hem, a garment of delicate artistry against the raw wilderness. Her black hair had come loose from its pins and lay like spilled ink against the snow. For a moment, he thought she was dead, another soul claimed by the unforgiving indifference of the high country. Then, a faint tremor ran through her, a shudder so deep it seemed to shake her very bones. She was alive. Barely. Jedediah approached with a caution born of a lifetime spent among wary things. He knelt, his large frame casting a shadow over her. The fabric of her dress was stiff with frost, and the skin of her exposed hands was a pale, bluish white. He reached out a hand, thick-fingered and calloused, but hesitated, letting it hover in the air just above her shoulder. He was used to the silence of the mountains, a silence broken only by wind and animal calls, not the fragile stillness of a dying human. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and unused. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. She did not stir. He knew he could not leave her here. To do so would be to condemn her to a slow, cold death, her body a frozen statue for the spring thaw to find. He had seen it before. With a sigh that turned to a cloud of white, he gently touched her arm. The cold of her flesh seeped through his glove, a stark and alarming chill. At his touch, she flinched violently, a small, terrified sound escaping her lips. Her head lifted, and her eyes, wide with fear, fixed on his face. They were dark, almond-shaped eyes, and in their depths swam a terror so profound it silenced the wind. She saw a giant, a wild man of the woods looming over her, his face obscured by a thicket of beard and hair, his sheer size a threat in itself. She tried to scramble away, her movements clumsy and weak, her frozen limbs refusing to obey. He held up his hands, showing they were empty. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice softer this time. "Not here to harm you." He pulled a strip of dried venison from a pouch at his belt and held it out. She stared at it, then back at him, confusion warring with fear. He set it down in the snow beside her and then spoke the words, simple and direct, freighted with the gravity of her situation. "Come home with me, if you want." Unli stared at the hulking figure before her. His words were simple, but understanding them felt like trying to grasp smoke. The cold had seeped into her mind, slowing her thoughts to a thick, syrupy crawl. Fear was the only thing that felt sharp, a shard of ice in her chest. This man was a barbarian of the mountains, the kind of man her husband had warned her about, a savage who lived like an animal. Yet, the animal that had cast her out wore fine clothes and spoke in polished tones. This man, for all his wildness, had a stillness in his eyes. There was no cruelty there, only a solemn quiet. She looked from his face to the piece of dried meat in the snow. Hunger was a dull, constant ache that had become her only companion. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The wind tore at her thin cheongsam, a constant, biting reminder that the forest was not her home, it was her tomb. The choice was not between this stranger and safety, but between this stranger and certain death. A slow, shuddering nod was all she could manage. It was an acceptance born of absolute desperation. Seeing her assent, Jedediah moved with surprising gentleness. He bundled her in a thick wool blanket he unrolled from his pack, the rough fabric smelling of wood smoke and pine. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, her small, cold form cradled against his massive chest. The world tilted, a blur of white snow and dark trees, and then she knew no more, succumbing to the exhaustion that had been dragging her under. The journey to his cabin was a silent trek against the fury of the storm. Jedediah navigated the dense woods with an instinctual knowledge of every ridge and ravine, his powerful legs carrying them steadily upward. Unli was a fragile weight in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder. He could feel the desperate, weak beat of her heart against his ribs, a frantic sparrow trapped in a cage of ice. The cabin, when they reached it, was less a structure and more an extension of the mountain itself. Built of thick, dark logs chinked with mud and moss, it was hunkered down into the slope, its roof heavy with a thick blanket of snow. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a beacon of warmth in the desolate landscape. Inside, a fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow across the single room. The air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and stewed herbs. It was a Spartan place, furnished only with what was necessary for survival, a rough-hewn table, a single chair, a bed built into the wall and piled high with furs, and shelves filled with dried goods in clay jars. It was a world of quiet, masculine solitude. He laid her down gently on the fur pile by the hearth, the warmth from the flames beginning to seep into her frozen body. He moved about the cabin with a quiet efficiency, ladling a thin, steaming broth into a wooden bowl. He placed it beside her, not speaking, allowing the warmth and the safety of the small space to be his only words. For 3 days, the storm raged outside, a relentless assault of wind and snow that sealed the cabin off from the rest of the world. Inside, a different kind of quiet reigned. Unli drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, her body fighting off the deep chill that had settled into her bones. Jedediah was a constant, unobtrusive presence. He kept the fire roaring, replacing the broth by her side with fresh, hot bowls before the old ones grew cold. He never pressed her to eat, but he was always there when a moment of clarity returned and she found the strength to lift the bowl to her lips. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were brief and practical. "More water." "The fire is warm," she would answer with a slight nod or a shake of her head, her voice still a frozen thing in her throat. She watched him from beneath the heavy furs. He moved with a purpose that was both powerful and gentle. She saw him mend a snowshoe with deft, careful fingers, sharpen his knife with a steady, rhythmic scrape of stone on steel, and check the salted meat hanging from the rafters. He was a man of immense self-sufficiency, a being perfectly attuned to his harsh environment. The fear she had first felt began to dissolve, replaced by a profound and weary gratitude. He had saved her life, and he asked for nothing in return. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Sunlight, thin and pale, pierced through the cabin's single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Unli awoke feeling a clarity she hadn't known since before her husband had driven her from their home. The fever was gone. She sat up, the furs pooling around her waist. Jedediah was at the table, cleaning a brace of rabbits, his back to her. She looked down at herself. The grey cheongsam was wrinkled and stained, a sad relic of a life that no longer existed. She found a small tear in the silk near the collar. With trembling fingers, she began to search the pockets of the dress her mother had made for her, hoping to find the small sewing kit she always carried. It was gone, lost somewhere in the snow. A wave of despair washed over her, a grief for small, lost things that felt immense. He must have heard the small, choked sound she made. He turned, his knife still in his hand. His gaze was not intrusive, but steady and questioning. She pointed to the tear, the simple gesture conveying a world of loss. He watched her for a long moment, then rose and went to a small wooden chest in the corner. He returned with a needle and a spool of dark, sturdy thread, placing them in her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, his skin rough and warm. It was the first time they had touched since he carried her here. The simple, human contact was grounding, a quiet anchor in the lonely silence. Weeks melted into a quiet rhythm, measured by sunrises and sunsets. An-Li's strength returned, and with it, a tentative peace. The cabin became her world, a warm, safe pocket in the vast, indifferent wilderness. She learned the landscape of Jedediah's silence, discovering it was not one of emptiness, but of deep, reflective stillness. She began to help with small tasks, her movements growing more confident. She learned to grind corn for bread, to patch his thick woolen shirts with the needle and thread he had given her, her small, neat stitches a stark contrast to his own rough mending. She would sweep the hearth, her motions graceful and deliberate, bringing a sense of order to the rustic space. He, in turn, adapted to her presence. He started leaving a bucket of fresh water inside for her each morning and began to speak more, his sentences still short but no longer just functional. He would point out the window and say, "Snowshoe Hare," or "That ridge is called Widow's Peak." He told her his name was Jedediah. She told him hers was An-Li. The names hung in the air between them, simple offerings of identity in a place that had stripped everything else away. One afternoon, while he was out checking his trap lines, a shift in the winter light caught her eye. The relentless white was giving way to a softer, grey-blue hue as the sun dipped below the peaks. She stood by the window, watching the play of colors on the snow, when she saw them. 3 figures on horseback, dark silhouettes against the distant, snow-covered foothills. They were moving slowly, methodically, as if searching. A cold dread, colder than any winter wind, washed over her. It was him. It had to be. Her husband, or men sent by him. They had come for her. The fragile piece she had found shattered into 1,000 pieces. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. The cabin, which had been her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. She backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every creak of the logs a footstep. She huddled in the darkest corner of the cabin, pulling one of the heavy furs over her head, trying to make herself disappear. When Jedediah returned an hour later, the sun gone and the world plunged into twilight, he found the cabin nearly dark, the fire burned down to embers. A profound stillness hung in the air, but it was the stillness of fear, not peace. He saw her then, a small, trembling mound of fur in the corner. He set down the rabbits he carried and approached slowly. "An-Li," he said, his voice low. She didn't respond. He knelt beside her and gently pulled back the fur. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a terror that clawed at him. She pointed a trembling finger towards the window, towards the darkening world outside. "Men," she whispered, the word broken. "They look for me." Jedediah's face, usually a mask of stoic calm, hardened into something formidable. The quiet solitude in his eyes was replaced by a protective fire, fierce and unwavering. He didn't waste time with questions about who the men were or why they were searching for her. Her terror was reason enough. He rose to his full, imposing height, his presence filling the small cabin, and for the first time, An-Li understood that his size was not a threat, but a shield. He moved with a swift, silent purpose that spoke of a deep, primal instinct to defend his territory. First, he went to the fire, adding logs until it blazed high, pushing the shadows back into the corners. The light was a defiant roar against the encroaching darkness. Then he went to the door and slid a heavy wooden bar into place, its solid thud echoing in the tense silence. He checked the single-shuttered window, ensuring it was securely latched. His actions were calm, methodical, and profoundly reassuring. He was not panicking, he was preparing. He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "You are safe here," he said. It was not a question or a plea, but a statement of absolute fact. A promise. He took a heavy axe from its place by the hearth, its honed edge gleaming, and set it on the table. He did not brandish it, but its presence was a clear message. He then took up a position in the single chair, positioning it so he could watch both the door and the window, and simply waited. The night deepened, the silence inside the cabin a stark contrast to the imagined sounds of approaching hoofbeats. An-Li remained in her corner, the fur pulled around her shoulders like a protective shell. She watched him, this mountain man who owed her nothing, as he sat his silent vigil. He did not sleep. He did not move, save for the slow rise and fall of his chest. He was a stone wall between her and the world that had hurt her, a guardian carved from the very heart of the mountain. In his stillness, she found a sliver of courage. The fear was still there, a coiling serpent in her gut, but it was no longer all-consuming. It was tempered by the steady, unyielding presence of the man who had offered her a home. Hours passed. The fire crackled, the logs hissed and popped, and the wind moaned around the eaves of the cabin. Jedediah remained awake, his gaze fixed, his body a study in patient readiness. He was waiting for a threat he did not know, on behalf of a woman he barely understood, driven by a simple, profound moral code that the mountain itself had taught him: you protect what is vulnerable. The sound came just before dawn, a dull thud against the cabin door. An-Li flinched, pulling the fur tighter around herself. Jedediah didn't move, his eyes fixed on the thick wood. Then a voice, coarse and impatient, cut through the morning quiet. "We know she's in there, trapper. Send out the Chinaman's wife." The voice was thick with arrogance, accustomed to being obeyed. Another man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. An-Li recognized the tone, the casual cruelty. They were her husband's men, enforcers from the small, dusty town at the foot of the mountains. Jedediah rose slowly from his chair, his shadow stretching long and menacing in the firelight. He picked up the axe, not as a weapon, but as an extension of his will, letting it rest in the crook of his arm. He moved to the door, he stepped silent on the wooden floor. He did not open it. Instead, he spoke through the wood, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very logs of the cabin. "There's no one here by that name." There was a pause, then another loud bang on the door. "Don't play games with us, old man. We saw her tracks leading this way. Her husband wants her back. He paid good money for her." The words hung in the air, ugly and possessive. An-Li closed her eyes, shame and fear washing over her. Paid for. That was all she was to them. Jedediah's voice dropped even lower, losing all trace of civility. "This is my land. The person in this cabin is under my protection. Turn your horses around and ride back down the mountain." A string of curses came from outside, followed by the sound of a man dismounting. "Protection? You're one man. There are three of us. Now open this door before we decide to burn it down." Jedediah leaned his forehead against the coldwood for a moment, his eyes closed. Then he lifted the heavy bar. He opened the door just enough to step outside, pulling it shut behind him, placing his body squarely in the opening. The three men recoiled slightly at the sight of him. In the pale morning light, he looked even larger, more elemental, than he had in the forest. His face was a grim mask, his eyes cold as glacial ice. He held the axe loosely at his side. "I won't say it again," he said, his voice deathly quiet. Leave the leader, a man with a scarred face and a sneer, took a step forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "You're making a mistake." Jedediah didn't even glance at the gun. His focus was entirely on the man's eyes. He took one step forward, a small, deliberate movement that was more intimidating than any shout. The sheer, unmovable certainty of him gave them pause. They were bullies, used to preying on the weak. This man was not weak. He was a force of nature, and they were standing in his path. The men exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't the easy job they'd been promised. After a long, tense moment, the leader spat on the ground. "This ain't over." He backed away, remounted his horse, and without another word, the three of them turned and rode away, their threat swallowed by the vast, silent wilderness. When Jedediah stepped back inside and barred the door, the tension in the cabin did not immediately dissipate. It lingered in the air, thick and heavy. An-Li was still huddled in the corner, her body trembling with the aftermath of her fear. He walked over to the hearth and stoked the fire, his movement slow and deliberate, as if trying to physically push the ugliness of the morning away. He did not look at her, giving her space to collect herself. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the flames. Finally, she spoke, her voice a fragile whisper. "They will come back." He turned to face her then, his expression softening from the hard mask he had worn at the door. Maybe, he conceded, his voice returning to its usual quiet rumble. But this mountain is not an easy place for men like that. They are loud. The mountain is quiet. It does not favor them. He came and sat on the floor a few feet from her, not so close as to be threatening, but near enough to offer comfort. He simply sat with her in the silence, sharing the quiet aftermath of the storm they had weathered together. After a long time, she found the courage to speak again, the words tumbling out in her fragmented English, pieced together from the few lessons a kind missionary had given her years ago. "My husband. He is a trader. He say I bring him shame. No, son. He paid for me. Like a horse." Each word was a painful confession, a piece of the story she had carried locked inside her. Jedediah listened without interruption, his gaze steady and patient. He did not offer empty platitudes or easy reassurances. He simply listened, his presence a testament to her words, validating her pain with his quiet attention. When she fell silent, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks, he reached out and placed a hand on the fur blanket covering her shoulder. His touch was firm, grounding. "You are not a horse," he said, the word simple and profound. "You are a person. And you are welcome in this home." The word home struck a chord deep within her. It was a word she had associated with fear, obligation, and disappointment. Here, in this rough cabin with this silent giant, it was beginning to mean something else entirely: safety, acceptance, and a quiet, unassuming kindness that was more precious than any silk or jade. A fragile trust, born in the crucible of fear and defiance, had finally taken root between them. As winter's iron grip began to loosen, the world outside the cabin started to change. The days grew longer, the sunlight gained a sliver of warmth, and the constant blanket of white began to recede, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath. The sound of dripping water from the eaves became the new rhythm of their days, a gentle, persistent promise of spring. The fear of her husband's men returning faded with the melting snow, becoming a distant echo rather than an immediate threat. Jedediah and Lee fell into a comfortable domesticity, a partnership forged in silence and necessity that was now blooming with a quiet affection. He began to show her the secrets of his world. He took her into the thawing forest, pointing out the tender green shoots of wild onions pushing through the soil and the places where the deer came to drink from the newly freed streams. He showed her how to read the tracks in the mud, the delicate print of a fox, the heavy tread of a bear emerging from its den. He never tried to teach her to hunt or to trap, but he shared the knowledge of the land itself, its cycles of death and renewal. In return, she brought a different kind of life to his solitary existence. She began to cook, using the herbs he gathered to add new flavors to their simple stews. She taught him the names for the sun and the moon in her language, Taiyang and Yuelyang, her voice soft as she pointed to the sky. He would repeat the words, his deep voice stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds, and a rare, small smile would touch his lips. One afternoon, as she was mending one of his shirts by the fire, he watched her fingers move, small and nimble, as she worked the needle. "Your hands are made for finer things," he said, the observation unexpected. She looked up, surprised. "My mother taught me," she said simply. "She made beautiful things." He nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. A few days later, he returned from a trip to the lower valley with a small, carefully wrapped package. Inside was a skein of fine, crimson silk thread. Her eyes widened. It was an impossible luxury in this rugged world. "For your beautiful things," he said gruffly, avoiding her gaze. That evening, she began to embroider a small, delicate flower onto the sleeve of the shirt she was mending, the vibrant red a startling, joyful splash of color against the drab wool. It was a silent, beautiful conversation, a thread of gratitude and affection woven into the fabric of their quiet lives. The last of the snow vanished from all but the highest, shaded crevices of the peaks. The mountain exploded into a riot of life. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in swathes of blue and yellow, and the air grew thick with the scent of pine sap and damp earth. The world felt new, washed clean, and reborn. And Lee felt reborn with it. The haunted, fearful look in her eyes was replaced by a serene light. Her laughter, when it came, was a rare and beautiful sound, like the melody of a hidden stream. She had shed the skin of the person she had been forced to be, the timid, shamed wife, and was discovering the resilient, capable woman who had survived the winter. Jedediah, too, was changed. The profound solitude he had cultivated for years had been breached, not by an invasion, but by a welcome presence. He found himself talking more, sharing stories of his youth, of the family he had lost long ago to sickness, the tragedy that had driven him to the isolation of the mountains. He spoke of his grief, and she listened, her quiet empathy a balm on old wounds he hadn't realized were still raw. They had become each other's confessors, their shared pasts creating a bond deeper than words. One evening, they sat outside the cabin, watching the sun set behind the jagged peaks. The sky was a canvas of orange, pink, and deep violet. A gentle breeze stirred the pines, and the world was peaceful. An-Li had finished her embroidery on his shirt, a chain of small, crimson flowers now circling the cuff. He wore it as if it were a king's raiment. "It is beautiful here," she said, her voice soft. "Not like the town. The town is loud. Full of ghosts." He knew what she meant. The ghosts of her past, the spectre of the man who had bought her and discarded her. He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught the curve of her cheek and the quiet strength in her profile. He had found her half frozen, a broken bird in the snow. Now, she was vibrant, alive. She had healed him as much as he had healed her. "The ghosts don't climb this high," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "The air is too thin for them." She smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "I think you are right," she whispered. The trust between them had blossomed into something more profound, a deep, unspoken love that was as solid and enduring as the mountains surrounding them. It was a love built not on grand declarations, but on shared silence, simple kindnesses, and the mutual salvation of two lonely souls. The cabin was no longer just his shelter, it was their home. The singular masculine energy of the place had softened, balanced by her presence. A pot of wildflowers sat on the windowsill. The furs on the bed were always neatly arranged. Her few possessions, the worn grey cheongsam, now carefully folded in the wooden chest, and the precious spool of red thread, were integrated into the space. It was a shared life, woven together from two vastly different worlds. The threat from the valley seemed to belong to another lifetime. They never saw her husband's men again. As Jedediah had predicted, the mountain did not favor them, and their lazy greed was no match for its harsh realities. An-Li's past had been a cage, but here, in the vast, open wilderness, she was finally free. She had found a new strength within herself, a resilience she never knew she possessed. She could read the sky for signs of changing weather, identify edible plants, and walk for miles through the forest without fear. She was no longer a fragile piece of silk, she was as hardy as the alpine flowers that bloomed amidst the rocks. One evening, as twilight settled a purple cloak over the valley below, they stood together at the cabin door, looking out at the world they had built. The air was cool and clean, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. An-Li leaned her head against the solid wood of the doorframe, a sense of profound peace settling over her. "This place," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "it is quiet." Jedediah did not look at the breathtaking vista. His gaze was fixed on her. He saw not just the woman he had rescued, but the woman who had, in turn, rescued him from a lifetime of lonely silence. He had offered her a refuge, and she had given him a reason to live in it, not just exist. He reached out and gently took her hand, his large, rough fingers closing around hers. "It is now," he said. The simple words were a promise, an acknowledgement of all they had been through and all that lay ahead. Home was not a place you were given, but a place you made. And here, on the wild edge of the world, two solitary people had found their way home, together.